The Gilded Age is produced by Universal Television and brought to you by HBO of Warner Media. All characters, plot points, and footage are property of HBO. The Gilded Age is a brand new drama airing exclusively on HBO Max. Join your friends at Free Tours by Foot as we take you through New York City, showing you actual locations from the show, locations in New York City the show is based around, discuss plot points, and go over the actual history of all of the events of the Gilded Age. And remember to book your tour with freetoursbyfoot.com the next time you visit New York City or any one of our other locations. And now, on to Katherine.
Hey everyone, we're back. Gilded Age episode 3 just dropped on Monday. I'm sure you were watching. I definitely was. Stuff is getting really exciting. Just as a warning, in this particular episode of our series, there are going to be some spoiler alerts. So if you have not watched episode 3 of the Gilded Age yet, stop watching this video. Come back and visit us after you have watched. So there's a lot to talk about, but right now we are in Madison Square Park. So Madison Square Park was a very prominent feature in this week's episode of The Gilded Age. This is where Marion and Peggy, as her chaperone, come and meet up with her lawyer friend, Mr. Rakes. And ultimately, Mr. Rakes gives a very surprise marriage proposal to Marion Brooke. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. But I can tell you, I don't think her Aunt Agnes is going to be very happy. So what they're doing here in Madison Square Park in the episode is visiting the arm and the torch of the Statue of Liberty. And it might look a little bit strange seeing this disembodied arm and torch, but this was a very real thing that happened right here in Madison Square Park. So the idea of the Statue of Liberty, or Liberty Enlightening the World, is that it was a gift to the United States from the people of France in honor of our centennial in 1876. But because of some various delays and issues with the creation of the Statue of Liberty, we didn't actually dedicate it in New York Harbor until October of 1886. So there was 10 years in between there. So if you're wondering where was it in those 10 years, well, for some of the time, the arm and the torch was here in Madison Square Park. Initially, this was done as a way to generate interest from the people of New York in this statue that was going to be in their harbor in the very near future. So initially this arm and torch wasn't in the United States in Madison Square Park. It was at the Centennial Exposition World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876. After the fair was over, they moved the arm and the torch here to Madison Square Park. And it was actually a common leisure activity to come and visit the arm and the torch. The torch had a platform encircling it, so you could walk up the arm and go on the platform. And at the World's Fair, this was a very popular way to get a view of the fairgrounds, and then here in Madison Square Park to get some city views. So this was actually a leisure activity, and visiting it was an outing for people, just like you're seeing from Marion Brooke and Mr. Rakes. Now actually, because the Gilded Age is set in 1882, when they are seen visiting, it would have been one of the very last opportunities to do that, because the arm and the torch was removed from Madison Square Park in 1882. It was here from 1876 until 1882. What happened to it after that? Well, it was actually shipped back to France because the entire Statue of Liberty was being assembled in full and presented formally to the US ambassador to France in a presentation. So this was done, and actually the statue stayed in France for a little while because the US wasn't ready to hold up our end of the bargain. Only the statue was an actual gift. The US was meant to finance and build the pedestal that the statue is sitting on. And fundraising for that pedestal was not going very well for a little while. It had really stalled. We ended up doing the final fundraising push primarily through a newspaper drive that was sponsored by Joseph Pulitzer. So they said anybody who donated anything to the pedestal of the statue during this final push would have their name listed in the New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's paper, as an official donor. Even if you gave 1 penny, you were going to be listed as a donor. So this is how they did it. They raised over $100,000 that way, and people were sending in $1, 5 cents. There was a kindergarten class in the Midwest that all pooled their money and they sent in $1.35. A stock boy on Wall Street gave a nickel. They were all listed as donors. So think the way we do crowdfunding online today, GoFundMe, Kickstarter, these little bits of money that really do add up and make a difference. This was the original version, was the crowdfunding for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. There's actually a lot more to this story and a lot to know about how the statue was created, why it was created, the artist behind it, the inspiration, the designer of the pedestal. It's quite involved. So please check out, if you are interested, Free Tours by Foot has a full video tour of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, actually, where it goes into much more detail about all of this. But this setting that you saw in episode 3 of The Gilded Age, along with the marriage proposal, would have absolutely been a real thing you could have done in New York in 1882. All right, now let's talk for a minute about arguably the most dramatic turn of events from episode 3 of The Gilded Age. And this is all of the drama surrounding the railroad, George Russell's railroad, and the stock prices, and what culminates in this very tragic suicide of Mr. Morris. So let's go back and recap just a little bit of what happened here, because this actually starts in episode 2. George Russell has approached the aldermen saying, hey, I want to expand my railroad and I want to build a new station in New York. And by the way, if all of your fellow aldermen and yourself buy up stock in my company, we're all going to make a huge profit as my stock continues to rise. What the aldermen decide to do instead of that is called shorting the stock. So what they've decided to do is cause George Russell's railroad stock to plummet, and in order to do that, they're going to revoke the permission that they have given him verbally to build this new station and expand this railroad. If while watching this part of the episode you were sitting there saying, hey, wait a second, where is the SEC? They don't exist yet. They would not exist until the 1930s. So actually what's going on here, while it sounds crazy, was completely legal at the time. Now, what these aldermen were not prepared for is that George Russell came back swinging, and he used every single bit of the money and the wealth that he had amassed to come back and buy up all of the available stock in his railroad. So rather than causing it to plummet, he actually caused the price to remain steady and then go up. So if as you're watching this, you were a little bit confused about what exactly was happening and what is this, I'm going to give you a quick explanation of how shorting stock works. If you know this already, bear with me for a minute, but if you don't, I want to help kind of decode what this is. So essentially, shorting stock is borrowing stock. You're borrowing it for a set amount of time, and you have to give it back at the end of that set amount of time. Now, the reason you would do this is because you have the expectation that that stock is going to decrease in price. So that's what these aldermen were doing. They knew it was going to decrease in price to them because they were going to block his progress forward. So you would borrow this stock and you would immediately turn around and sell it for whatever the current market value is. And then at the end of this period of time that you were able to borrow it, you are required to give back those shares. So you're going to have to go and buy up the same amount of shares that you borrowed and return them. Now, if that stock has done what you wanted and dropped dramatically in price, then you are buying them back for a much lower price than what you sold them for, and you're going to make a tidy profit. So you may have actually, this might sound a little bit recognizable to you, because this is actually what was going on just a year ago with all the drama around the GameStop stop. That was exactly what was happening, is people were trying to short the stock, and because people were buying up GameStop, it was actually rising and people were losing a lot of money. So this is the same thing that you're seeing going on in episode 3 of The Gilded Age, what these aldermen are attempting to do. And it is very dramatic, and you might have watched all of this going on and assuming this was one of the storylines that was completely fictionalized for the purposes of this TV show. It was not. This was actually based on very real events that happened about 20 years before The Gilded Age is set in 1882. And so this involves the family that built the station that you can see behind me right now, Grand Central Terminal. Now, this building would not have been here in 1882, but the Vanderbilts have had a station here on this spot for many, many years, including during the Gilded Age. So this all goes back to Cornelius Vanderbilt. In 1862, Mr. Vanderbilt took an interest in what was called the Harlem Railroad. The railroad wasn't very large, wasn't doing particularly well at the time, but it was the only rail line that went into New York City. And so he started just buying up shares in the Harlem Railroad, and he bought up enough shares eventually to where he had the controlling interest in the Harlem Railroad. And then he decided he was ready to expand it. And he went to the city council to get permission to expand the Harlem Railroad so that it would run down Broadway all the way to the Battery. So not only would it be the only line that came into New York City, it would run the entire length of the island of Manhattan. This was going to be a game changer. So they could have opted to do what Mr. Russell proposed in the Gilded Age, and these city council members could have bought up stock in the Harlem Railroad and let this plan go forward, and they all could have profited. But much like you saw in the Gilded Age, they decided to try to short the stock. And one of the reasons they thought that this would be a relatively easy win on their part is actually by the time of these events, Cornelius Vanderbilt was a little bit older. He was already in his 60s. And so people thought, he's too late in his life to be getting into a new business venture, particularly a new business he doesn't know that much about. And also Cornelius Vanderbilt himself had floated a rumor that he didn't have a lot of cash reserves at the time, that his buying power was relatively weak. And so a director of the Harlem Railroad, Daniel Drew, who was a former rival of Cornelius Vanderbilt's from his days as a shipping magnate, went to the city council members and said, hey, don't buy up the stock, don't give him permission to expand the line, revoke the permission, and actually pass legislation saying that it's not allowed to expand the railroad into New York. We're gonna be able to tank his stock. And so Daniel Drew and the city council members bought up as much stock as they possibly could in the Harlem Railroad, and they just sat there and they waited for it to drop. But much like George Russell in the Gilded Age TV show, Cornelius Vanderbilt, contrary to the rumors he himself had spread, was not low on cash reserves, and actually also had several allies that he had recruited to help him out. And he started buying up all available stock in the Harlem Railroad. So rather than the price plummeting the way the city council members and Daniel Drew were planning on, the stock held steady. And then it started to go up. And then it continued to increase. So not only was it not tanking, it was actually going past the price that they had originally borrowed their shares at. So not only were they not going to make money, they were all going to lose money. And the problem is Cornelius Vanderbilt seemed completely content to just continue buying his shares and to continue to keep them going up and up and up. The other problem was that, again, if you think about what I told you about shorting stock, at the end of this period of time, you have to return your shares. So there have to be some shares that you can buy back in order to return them. The only share, there were no available market shares. Cornelius Vanderbilt had all of the other shares. So they were only going to be able to buy them back at whatever price Cornelius Vanderbilt wanted. And so actually, very much like you saw in the Gilded Age, these council members approached Cornelius Vanderbilt. They begged for mercy. Unlike the show, Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't relent entirely, but rather than sitting there and continuing to just let the stock price keep rising, he allowed them to buy back the stock, although they had to buy it back at about 80% more than they had first purchased it for. So people lost a lot of money, including Daniel Drew, who had kind of orchestrated this whole scheme. And believe it or not, and I'll be curious if they decide to use this in the Gilded Age, Daniel Drew turned around and tried it again a year later. And he decided to do it on a larger scale. Rather than going to the City Council of New York, he went to the legislature in Albany, and he got the state legislators to try to do the same thing. But Cornelius Vanderbilt recognized it immediately. They had just tried it a year ago, and he did the same thing again, except this time he wasn't feeling so charitable. He was ready, he said, to let the price of an individual stock go all the way to $1,000 a piece, which was absolutely astronomical. Fortunately, he did relent. He allowed the people involved in this scheme to buy back stock at $285 a share, which was still dramatically higher than what they had purchased. A lot of people lost a lot of money. Daniel Drew himself lost $500,000, which was a lot of money at the time. So even though all of this did not culminate in any tragic suicides the way you saw in the Gilded Age, this is absolutely based on a very, very real thing that happened, and the details of the events are very, very similar to what you saw. Now, clearly, this did not take the Vanderbilts down the way it was intended, because they continued to thrive in the railroads enough to build the current Grand Central Terminal that you could see behind me while we were walking. We ended episode 3 with some very dramatic plot lines hanging and leaving us in suspense. We do not know what Marion's response to Mr. Rake's marriage proposal is going to be, and we don't know what the aftermath of this drama involving the railroads and the stocks and Mr. Morris's suicide is going to look like. So we will certainly be waiting with bated breath for episode 4 along with all of you, and hopefully you will join us next week. I'm sure we will have a lot of exciting things to talk about. So this is a good opportunity to remind you, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to this channel, ring that bell so you get notifications when we release new content, because we have more Gilded Age coming your way. We'll see you next time.